Okay, so you tell me when you're ready.
Okay. I'm ready.
Excellent.
Are you ready?
Okay, I was, yeah. Okay. We're very lucky today to have Natasha Kearslake from Organic P&O Solutions with us. Recently, Wade McDonald released a report on how to reach the top in HR, which 150 HR leaders contributed to. I reached out to Tash because of her expertise to see if she could provide some thoughts around the report and also share some snippets about her career. Having started her career with a retail giant, working her way through the ranks, Tash has worked in a number of strategic HR roles before setting up her own consultancy 10 years ago. Tash and her team support organisations across all sizes and industries, offering a full range of HR services. But I will let her introduce herself because she will do it better. Hi, Natasha. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for inviting me to take part today. And thanks for a great introduction. I suppose to build a little bit on what you've said, we're a small organisation based in Reading. We thoroughly enjoy working with a variety of different types of clients, from very small to some quite bigger ones, and we provide a range of different things to different clients. So I'm hoping today will be a fun conversation, because having gone through the report, there's some really interesting highlights that I can understand, having come through the career route myself.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I will get straight into it. So one of the things that came out of the report was the key technical skills that current leaders thought that future leaders would need. They came out as cultural development, change management, business partnering, and data analysis. To me, they seem like a diverse set of skills. So I wondered what it looks like when HR deliver them well.
They're definitely an interesting set of criteria. There's certainly nothing particularly surprising in what's come out, I think, from the report. If we take them kind of one by one, we can see, I think, that cultural development and change management potentially go hand in hand. You can't develop a culture unless you can be prepared to change. You can't evoke change unless you're really looking at the kind of culture that you want to foster. And I think the HR people in the future and leaders of the future are really going to have to think about those as topics that are they're so unique to different people and businesses. In terms of business partnering and data analysis, those two things have seen a massive shift, I think, over HR in the last probably 10 to 15 years, maybe a bit longer. Business partnering has evolved, wasn't even a term, dare I say, when I first started. So business partnering has certainly evolved, and I think it's now starting to form more of a bridging of a gap between employees and employers as much as anything else. I think one of the main things that's going to drive all three of those things is the data analysis piece, though, because the data analysis piece, we've now got so many different ways of getting different types of data. I think there's going to be a real challenge for people in the future to determine what data they really need and what data is really going to be useful. And that will help inform them across how they approach the cultural development, the change management, and the business partnering.
Okay, no, that's interesting. I mean, I think we saw very similar within the finance report that we did recently, not necessarily with cultural development because that's more HR related, but certainly in terms of data analysis and the skill set changing to people that could use data and then work their decisions around that. So it's interesting that that's cross-functional. Okay, so in terms of softer skills, communication and collaboration were the top two. But I was a little bit surprised that only 27% of people chose empathy. What are your views on empathy as a HR leader, and how do you think they play into the other two skills?
I think it's a really interesting take, because communication and collaboration are very big umbrella skill sets, and they involve so many different things. And of course, we need both of those things everywhere in business to be at play if we're going to work well productively. Empathy, for me, is at the core of all of that. You can't communicate well or collaborate well unless you've got a strong degree of empathy in understanding somebody else's perspective, perhaps a different viewpoint, perhaps a different set of experiences. I think from the diversity agenda, empathy becomes particularly important and is something that needs to be honed. So I'm really surprised that that's quite so low. In the HR field, I think it's probably the biggest key skill that an HR leader needs to have, not only for them to be able to operate really well, but for them to make sure that their populations can operate well. So are they fostering it? Are they supporting it? Are they helping people learn how to do it? And it's a skill. It's not something that we necessarily are born with. It's something that we hone. It's certainly something I've honed over my career. I'm definitely a very different Tash to the Tash that was around 20 years ago. So I think empathy is something that definitely grows over time. So I'd love to see that feature a bit more heavily, perhaps if you took your survey again.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, again, if I look at myself, I was accidentally promoted into management when I was 23 and given 7 staff. And I don't think I would have had any idea how to use empathy, or didn't have any empathy at that point. So I think you're right. It's something that grows as probably you go through different life situations.
Definitely.
So it's a life skill maybe feeding into work. But I definitely agree with you. I'd have thought it would have been a lot higher. And maybe it is because the other choices, because it was multiple choice, are bigger, overbranching. So yeah, I get that. Okay, so and this is perhaps the next question maybe feeds into empathy a bit as well. So since the pandemic, leaders have said they've had to develop their management skills in different ways, but these evolved greatly due to mental health, a rise in maybe awareness of well-being. They've just said well-being, but I think it's an awareness of it, and flexible working.
Yeah.
So what do you think current leaders can do to help the next generation develop strong organisational practices in these areas?
I think you're absolutely right to put the empathy piece next to this piece. I think it's really important that these agendas are absolutely growing, and they really must, and they have to. And I know there are some brilliant HR teams out there that are doing some wonderful work across all of those topics. I think when we're thinking about growing the next generation of leaders, because they won't have grown through it in the way that this population has, we're going to need to think carefully about how we take them on the same journey of this is where we were versus this is where we are now, because it's definitely an experiential learning process, understanding well-being, understanding mental health, and understanding what kind of adaptations are helpful rather than just the flexible working approach that the legislation might tell us to follow. So I think, in a nutshell, for me, the next generation of HR professionals very much needs to understand what they've experienced, but also start to think about how we continually further that agenda, how we continually develop understanding. We don't just go, right, okay, we've got an understanding now and leave it there.
Yeah, and again, I found that very interesting, because the amount of people that I know or have spoken to that, for instance, might have done a mental health awareness course, and I've had to do one, well, not had to, chose to, since the pandemic, has got obviously bigger and bigger and bigger. But then what do you do with that afterwards? So
Absolutely.
I think a lot of this has probably been reactional so far,
Yeah.
and it'll be very interesting to see how that then is pushed forward in a proactive manner. I think so. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, a couple of other things, if that's okay, if you've got time. So we looked at areas which had slowed professional progression. And a bit of background to this, obviously we did the HR report and the finance report. In the finance report, I think I've said this to you before, but only about 25% of women made it to FD and CFO. In the HR report, it appears to be the complete opposite. In finance, people very much pointed to time off for family reasons as a reason why their career had slowed. And when we broke that down, that was more women than it was men. Right. But the same reason still came up in the HR report as slowing down in progression, except they maybe then didn't lead to the gender split that the finance report highlighted. So Time off family reasons, but also face not fitting also score quite highly. So what can the next generation do to help overcome the obstacles that maybe our generation hasn't figured out yet?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because personally, I was surprised by that result in the report as well. I was expecting that to be further ahead, or at least different, I think.
Yeah.
It wasn't. So I think the things that I notice here is that actually we've got a role to play in what policy looks like for these kinds of things. And it's not something necessarily I see being driven. We have policies in terms of these are the fair rules, these are the equitable rules, but we're not necessarily really thinking about how our policies shape something in the future. And so I think there's a role here for our next generation of leaders to do better than we've done in the past. Again, I can relate to my own experience. I can remember before I had my son and after I had my son, and I know that I would probably been a much better HR professional in terms of some of the decisions I've made if I'd understood some of the things that the working parents had been through. And that was whichever side of the journey that they were on for parenting. And I think the next level of generation, the next generation of professionals can really think about what actually are the core challenges we haven't addressed yet. Where are the gaps really? I'd love to see a drill down on actually when I say my face didn't fit, why did I really feel that? And also from an HR professional's perspective, is there enough searching of ourselves in that career? Is there something else I could have done to highlight something at the time that I didn't think was okay? Or is there something that I could have done that would have, whether somebody should have understood it or shouldn't have understood it, they didn't. And maybe there's something I can do to aid that conversation going forward. So that's in boardrooms, but it's also shop floors, it's on factory settings, it's out there on construction sites. It's what are we talking about? How are we supporting these kinds of topics and helping people bring their ideas to the table for how to solve it?
Yeah. And again, I think the face not fitting is obviously can be quite subjective.
Absolutely.
Which makes that one harder, I think, because some people perhaps who haven't got the progression in the time frame they would have liked may feel like that.
Yes.
And it may be true or it may not be, but obviously it's something to try and look at so that people don't feel like that. The family reasons, I think, is just so complex. Because again, even since I've been working and looked at the way things were, so I had my children got 16 and 18 years ago, and shared parental leave would not have existed. But I don't know that shared parental leave, it sounds great in theory, but I don't know in practice whether things like that have really made a big difference. So there has to be something else. And you would just
I'd entirely agree. Yeah, I'd entirely agree with you there, Chris. I think there's we still don't think as individuals. I've had people come into the team or into teams for clients, and actually they're not able to articulate what they need for their families, what their priorities are, what they would like. So I think there's a lot more to be done around what employers can do, but also what individuals can do to understand their needs and communicate those needs and see what's workable on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see what happens. But like I said, I think with more flexible working, which I know is too much of an overbranching term again, but hopefully that will have some impact moving forward. So we'll see. But okay, and very finally, just because it fits in a bit with the data answers from the beginning, but not wholly understand that. But the whole AI piece is obviously a very hot topic in everything at the moment.
Yes.
But similarly with the finance report, again, leaders do not seem to have any agreement whatsoever on how AI will impact hugely or not hugely. So I guess there is no right wrong at this stage, but I'm just really interested to think or understand what you think the impact of AI will be on HR.
Yes, it's a really fascinating one. I think it's a really fascinating one. And again, that whenever I speak to somebody, there's always a different perspective or a different understanding or none at all, actually. In some cases, actually, I don't want to know about it yet. So we're seeing the full change curve in terms of adoption and not at the moment across all sorts of areas. I personally, I love the concept of AI. I think it's brilliant. I've had a really good play with ChatGPT myself. I think it's a fascinating tool. I think I've asked it to do some things for me to see how it would compare to what a human does at the moment. And I think the most important thing that we need to understand about anything to do with AI is at the moment, it's at the earliest stage it could possibly be at for us. And so really for the future, it's going to be fascinating to see the differences that AI may or may not make to how we run our teams and our businesses and our customers. I think from my side of the coin, if I think about AI, there are lots of things that it could do for us that would really help. I think if you've particularly got a junior workforce that's learning, it might be useful. I know I asked it to produce an investigation report for me. So what are the highlights in investigation reports? And it came up with some really, really good stuff that I would have taken me quite a long time to explain to somebody. Excuse me. So I think it can provide some really useful tools to help us. What we need to make sure that we're doing is that we're not forgetting the human to human in the bids before we get to, you know, AI to AI. So the thing that scares me the most is AI to AI. You know, how do I even know that the right conversation has happened based on what I wanted it to be, which is where we're going, which is where we're headed to. So I think from an HR perspective, if I drill that right back down into just the profession, because there are so many possibilities for it, I think we have a responsibility to make sure we're informed about what it can do. I think we need to know where it is. We need to stay up with the technological advancements. We need to know, even if it's not something that we're familiar with, we need to know how the next generation are using it. We need to know how people that are fascinated by it want to use it and are going to use it. And then we can start to shape how we want it used, what its limitations are, what its scope is, but also how we start to foster it and engage with AI going forward. That's certainly a very, very hot topic I'm hearing at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was on a webinar last week hearing about how it's going to be used in recruitment, or is being used in recruitment already.
Yeah.
And there's some, you know, some very easy wins, I think, within recruitment for us. Yeah. But the wins that I'm not so sure about yet are how AI will look through CVs for somebody. And I know that's a bigger and bigger thing in bigger companies at the moment, but yeah, certainly within my role, that's the role of our consultant in my view. Yeah. But when it comes to well, even the report I've just written, like, I'm sure it would write it better for me by putting in some of the findings. Well, thank you, that's very kind. But you know, so it's areas around that, I think, but there will be some wins there, certainly in things that some recruiters would see as administrative. So it's coming, and I think people have got to get used to it, but it's just how. I think you're right. So be very interesting to see.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you for that. It's been really, really good speaking to you, and I appreciate, with everything you've told me before this started, that you're very, very busy at the moment. So I will let you get on with that. But thank you so much for this. And I hope everyone will obviously find it. Well, I'm sure they will find it useful.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for having me. It's been really enjoyable.
Brilliant. Thank you.